Jake Murphy had 3 rules for running his garage on the ass end of new Terra Colony. First, payment up front. Second, no questions about where you got the parts you want installed. Third, and most importantly, no sob stories. So naturally, when the little 4-armed alien rolled into his shop in what could generously be called a hover chair, but looked more like a floating shopping cart held together with hope and electrical tape, Jake knew his day was about to get complicated. "Excuse me, human person," the alien squeaked in that universal translator voice that always sounded like someone sucking helium through a kazoo. "I am told you fix things that others cannot fix. Yes?" Jake looked up from the engine he was rebuilding, wiped his greasy hands on an even greasier rag, and gave the newcomer his best go-away stare. The alien was maybe 3 feet tall, covered in what looked like purple fur, with those big Disney eyes that seemed designed specifically to make humans feel guilty. His hover chair was making a sound like a dying space whale. "Depends what needs fixing and how much you're paying," Jake grunted, already knowing he was going to regret this conversation. "Oh wonderful. I am Crix, of the Third Moon Mining Consortium." Well, former Third Moon Mining Consortium. There was an incident with a plasma drill, and now, Crix gestured with 2 of his 4 arms at his legs, which Jake now noticed were definitely not moving under their own power. And there it was. The sob story. Jake could feel his carefully constructed wall of cynicism developing its first crack. "Look, buddy. I fix ships, not medical equipment. You want the hospital down in New Shanghai District." "No no no," Crix said, his voice getting more excited and somehow even more helium kazoo-like. "I do not need medical fixing. I need transportation fixing. You see, this chair, it is very bad. Cannot go far. Cannot go fast. Cannot go anywhere my family is. But I hear human mechanics, they are very clever, yes? Very good at making impossible things work." Jake snorted. "Flattery will get you everywhere apparently. What exactly are you asking me to do?" Crix's 4 eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "I need you to build me wings." The wrench Jake had been holding clattered to the floor. This was either going to be the stupidest thing he'd ever agreed to do, or the most interesting. Knowing his luck, it would probably be both. "Kid," Jake said, running a hand through his graying hair, "I think you and I need to have a very long conversation about what's actually possible in this universe." But even as he said it, Jake was already looking at that pathetic hover chair and wondering what kind of engine he could cram into something that size. 20 minutes later, Jake was seriously questioning his life choices. Chris had spread out what appeared to be hand-drawn blueprints across Jake's workbench, and they looked like something a kindergartner might create if that kindergartner had been dropped on their head and then asked to design a spaceship. "So you see," Chris was saying, pointing with one arm while gesturing enthusiastically with the other 3, "it needs to be small enough for me to pilot alone, but big enough for life support systems. Fast enough to reach the outer moons, but fuel efficient enough to not bankrupt me. Oh, and it must have cup holders. Very important, cup holders." Jake stared at the drawings. "Kid, you're not asking me to fix a hover chair, you're asking me to build you a personal spacecraft from scratch. Do you have any idea what that would cost? What kind of permits you'd need? The engineering challenges alone would make a Centauri physicist weep." "Ah, but you see, I have thought of this." Chris pulled out a credit chip that looked suspiciously light. "I have exactly 437 credits, plus this very nice collection of rare minerals from my mining days." He produced a small bag of what looked like colorful gravel. Jake picked up one of the rare minerals and held it up to the light. It was definitely a painted rock. Possibly from someone's garden. "This is impossible," Jake muttered. But he was already walking over to his parts storage, mentally cataloging what he had available. "Completely, utterly, cosmically impossible. So you will do it." Jake turned around to find Chris practically vibrating with excitement in his terrible hover chair. Those big eyes were doing their Disney thing again. And damn it all, Jake could feel the last of his resistance crumbling like a stale cookie. "I'm going to regret this," he said, more to himself than to Chris. "I'm going to regret this so much that future generations of humans will use my stupidity as a cautionary tale." What followed could only be described as controlled chaos. Jake worked nights, weekends, and every spare moment he could steal, cobbling together components that had no business working together. He stripped the engine from a scrapped courier ship, married it to a navigation system he'd pulled from a luxury yacht, and somehow convinced a life support unit designed for deep-sea exploration to play nice with atmospheric processors meant for terraforming equipment. Chris, bless his purple furry heart, tried to help. He really did. Unfortunately, his idea of helping involved things like organizing Jake's tools by color instead of function, accidentally welding his own hover chair to the floor twice, and asking approximately 17,000 questions per hour. "What does this button do? Don't touch that. What about this lever? Definitely don't touch that. Ooh, what happens if I press these 3 buttons at the same time? Chris, no. The explosion was small, but it did take Jake 3 hours to get the soot stains off the ceiling. After that he assigned Chris to quality control, which mostly meant sitting in the corner and providing moral support while Jake performed what could generously be called engineering miracles, and more accurately be called throwing parts at a wall until something stuck. 6 weeks later, sitting in Jake's garage like a fever dream made manifest, was the most beautiful piece of junk that had ever been assembled by human hands. Jake stood back and admired his handiwork. Though admired might be too strong a word. The mini-ship looked like what would happen if a sports car had a baby with a toaster and that baby was raised by very creative but slightly drunk engineers. It was about the size of an old Earth Volkswagen Beetle, painted in a color that Jake generously called whatever primer was cheapest, and covered in more warning labels than a nuclear reactor. It is magnificent, Kritz whispered, his 4 eyes wide with something that might have been awe or terror, possibly both. It's a death trap with delusions of grandeur, Jake corrected, but there was a note of pride in his voice that he couldn't quite hide. The fuel efficiency is actually decent. The life support should keep you breathing for about 6 hours, and the navigation system only tries to plot courses through black holes on Tuesdays. Kritz was already maneuvering his hover chair toward the ship's tiny airlock. Jake had installed a specialized docking system that would let Kritz transfer directly from his chair into the pilot's seat without needing to walk. It had taken him 3 sleepless nights to figure out the mechanics, and he'd only sworn creatively in 4 different languages while building it. The controls are pretty straightforward, Jake said, opening the ship's manual he'd written by hand. Red button is emergency stop. Green button is go. The yellow button plays music, but I wouldn't recommend it unless you like polka. The navigation display shows your current position, desired destination, and fuel remaining. Try not to run into any asteroids on your first day out. Kritz was already strapping himself into the pilot's seat, his forearms moving across the controls with surprising grace. For someone who'd been stuck in a failing hover chair for months, he adapted to the ship's systems like he'd been born to fly. Initiating pre-flight sequence, Kritz announced in his most official voice, which still sounded like a chipmunk reading the evening news. All systems showing green. Well, mostly green. The one red light is probably not important. Yes, that red light means your engine is about to explode, Jake said dryly. But hey, what do I know? I only built the thing. Kritz's hands froze over the controls. You are joking, yes? Jake's poker face lasted exactly 3 seconds before he cracked a grin. Kid, relax. That red light means your coffee maker is ready. I figured you'd want caffeine for the trip. The relief on Kritz's face was so profound that Jake had to turn away and pretend to be very interested in organizing his toolbox. He was not, absolutely not, getting emotional about this moment. The ship's engines hummed to life with a sound like contented mechanical purring. Jake had tuned them himself, and they ran smoother than anything that had a right to given the circumstances of their assembly. Garage door opening, Jake called out, hitting the control that retracted the shop's main door. Beyond it lay the sprawling landscape of new Terra Colony, and beyond that, the star-filled darkness of space. Kritz engaged the thrusters with the gentlest touch, and the little ship rose from the garage floor like it was floating on a dream. It moved with precision and grace that belied its cobbled-together appearance, responding to Kritz's controls as if it had been waiting its whole existence for this moment. Jake, Kritz said over the comm system, his voice thick with emotion, I cannot find words. Don't go getting all mushy on me now, Jake replied, but his voice was rougher than usual. Just remember what I taught you about atmospheric entry angles, and for the love of all that's holy, don't try to impress anyone with fancy flying on your first day. The ship hovered at the garage entrance for a moment, and Jake could see Kritz silhouetted in the cockpit, his forearms spread across the controls like he was embracing the entire universe. Then, with a burst of blue flame from the thrusters, the ship shot forward into the night sky. Jake watched until the ship's lights became just another star in the constellation of New Terra's orbital traffic. Only then did he allow himself a small smile of satisfaction. Not bad for impossible, he muttered to himself, then headed back inside to clean up the mess. Tomorrow, he'd probably get back to normal repairs and regular customers who didn't need miracles. 3 days later, Kritz's voice crackled over the comm system, transmitted from somewhere near the third moon of Kepler 442. Jake, my friend. I am with my family, my little ones. They are so happy to see their papa can fly again. And the ship, it performs like a dream. Better than a dream. I have told them all about the miracle human mechanic who builds wings for the wingless. Jake grinned despite himself. Yeah, well, just remember our deal. You crash that thing, you're paying for the replacement parts. Never. Kritz's laughter filled the garage. This ship and I, we are bonded now. Like pilot and machine should be. You have given me back my life, Jake Murphy. I will not forget this. After the transmission ended, Jake stood in his quiet garage, looking at the empty space where the impossible project had taken shape. For the first time in years, he felt like he'd done something that actually mattered. He was just settling back into his routine when the ground began to shake. At first Jake thought it was an earthquake. New Terra Colony sat on a geologically active planet, and tremors were about as common as bad coffee and overpriced fuel. But earthquakes didn't usually announce themselves with the deep bone-rattling hum of military-grade fusion engines firing at full throttle. Jake stepped outside his garage just in time to see something that made his morning coffee turn to acid in his stomach. Descending from the cloud-scattered sky like the universe's most unwelcome party guest was a Terran military cruiser. Not just any cruiser, but one of the big ones. The kind that carried enough firepower to turn small moons into expensive gravel. Oh, fantastic, Jake muttered, watching the massive ship settle onto the empty lot next to his garage with all the grace of a falling building. Just absolutely fantastic. This is exactly how I wanted to start my Thursday. The ship was easily 10 times the size of his entire garage, a sleek wedge of dark metal and barely contained violence that made everything around it look like children's toys. Warning lights strobed along its hull, and Jake could see the business ends of enough weapons to make a pirate fleet nervous. The landing created a small dust storm that coated everything within 100 meters in fine grit. Jake's carefully hand-painted Murphy's Garage, no job too small sign now read something like Merp's Gag, O Ob O Mall, which somehow seemed fitting given the circumstances. A boarding ramp extended from the cruiser's belly with a mechanical whir that sounded suspiciously like the universe clearing its throat before delivering very bad news. What came down that ramp was exactly what Jake had been expecting and absolutely what he'd been dreading. Military personnel. Lots of them. The kind of military personnel who wore their uniforms like they'd been born in them and looked at civilian mechanics the way most people looked at particularly suspicious roadkill. Leading the parade was a woman who could only be described as aggressively competent. She was tall, sharp-featured, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd never met a problem she couldn't solve by either shooting it or court-martialing it. Her uniform was so perfectly pressed that Jake was pretty sure it violated several laws of physics. "Are you Jake Murphy?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made drill sergeants stand up straighter. Jake considered lying, briefly. He could claim to be Jake's cousin, or Jake's accountant, or possibly Jake's slightly slow brother who only spoke in grunts and pointed at things. But something about the woman's expression suggested that she already knew exactly who he was, where he'd been born, what he'd had for breakfast, and probably his opinion on the political situation in the Centauri system. "Depends who's asking," he said instead, which was probably the stupidest possible response but felt appropriately defiant. "Admiral Vex, Terran Military Special Operations Division." She extended a hand that Jake was fairly certain could crush walnuts. "We need to talk." Jake looked at the assembled military personnel, then at the massive cruiser that was currently making his garage look like a shed, then back at Admiral Vex's uncompromising stare. "Let me guess," he said, wiping his hands on his coveralls in what he hoped was a casual manner. "This is about Crix's ship. The unauthorized spacecraft you constructed using unregistered components and launched without proper permits or safety inspections." Admiral Vex's smile was the kind that sharks probably practiced in front of mirrors. "Yes, Mr. Murphy. This is about that ship." Jake's stomach performed what felt like a barrel roll followed by an emergency landing. "Look, I can explain. The little guy needed help, and I just relax, Mr. Murphy." Admiral Vex held up a hand. "You're not under arrest." "I'm not, no. In fact, we're here to offer you a job." Jake blinked, then blinked again. Then wondered if he was having some kind of stress-induced hallucination brought on by too much coffee and not enough sleep. "I'm sorry, what now?" Admiral Vex gestured to her entourage, and one of them stepped forward with what appeared to be a datapad. 3 days ago, your little friend Crix took his ship on a journey that should have been impossible for a craft of that size and configuration. He traveled from New Terra Colony to the outer moons of Kepler 442, a distance of approximately 47 light-years, in less than 6 hours. "Yeah, so, Mr. Murphy, our fastest military scouts take 12 hours to make that same journey. Our intelligence suggests that his ship achieved a fuel efficiency rating that exceeds our most advanced prototypes by a factor of 3. When our sensors detected the energy signature, we initially assumed it was some kind of new alien technology." Jake felt a growing sense of unease, like a man who just realized he was standing in a minefield while wearing tap shoes. It's not alien technology, it's just good engineering. That's exactly the problem, Admiral Vex said. Our top engineers have been analyzing the sensor data from Crix's flight. They can't figure out how you did it. The power-to-weight ratio should be impossible. The fuel consumption rates violate several fundamental principles of physics. And yet, there it is, flying around the system like a caffeinated butterfly. One of the other military officers stepped forward. Sir, we've completed our preliminary scans of the garage. The energy residue patterns confirm that this is indeed where the vessel was constructed. Admiral Vex nodded. Mr. Murphy, the Terran military is prepared to offer you a very lucrative contract. We want you to build us a fleet. Jake stared at her. A fleet. 50 ships, to start. Same specifications as the one you built for Crix, but modified for military applications. Scout ships, courier vessels, maybe some light fighters. The applications are endless. And if I say no? Admiral Vex's smile returned, and it was even less reassuring than before. Well, there is the matter of those unregistered components and unauthorized launches, and the fact that you're technically operating a spacecraft manufacturing facility without the proper licenses. The penalties for that sort of thing can be quite severe. Jake looked at the cruiser, then at the assembled military personnel, then at Admiral Vex's expectant expression. He had the distinct feeling that he was about to make a decision that would either make him very rich or very dead, possibly both. Jake rubbed his stubbled chin, buying time while his brain performed the kind of high-speed calculations usually reserved for navigation computers and tax auditors. On one hand, he was looking at enough money to buy his own planet. On the other hand, he'd be building weapons for people whose idea of conflict resolution involved turning other people into glowing dust. So let me get this straight, he said slowly. You want me to mass-produce ships for the military because mine work better than yours? Significantly better, Admiral Vex confirmed. Our preliminary analysis suggests your propulsion efficiency modifications could revolutionize space combat. Faster ships, longer range, reduced fuel costs. The strategic advantages are considerable. Jake glanced at the datapad one of the officers was holding. Even from a distance, he could see charts and graphs that looked like someone had graphed the word impossible in 17 different colors. And you have no idea how I did it. None whatsoever. Admiral Vex's admission clearly pained her. Our chief engineer, Commander Torres, has a PhD in applied physics from Mars Tech and 20 years of experience with military spacecraft. She took one look at your fuel efficiency numbers and locked herself in her quarters with a bottle of whiskey and a physics textbook. That bad, huh? She keeps muttering something about violating the laws of thermodynamics and asking why the universe hates her personally. Jake couldn't help but grin at that. He'd had similar conversations with physics textbooks over the years. Well, the thing is, Admiral, your engineers are thinking about this all wrong. How so? Jake walked over to his workbench and picked up a wrench. Not because he needed it, but because holding tools helped him think. Your military ships are built like military ships. Everything's over-engineered, over-armored, and over-complicated. You've got 17 different backup systems for your backup systems, enough armor to stop a meteor, and more computing power than most space stations. And that's a problem because you're trying to make a ship do everything perfectly instead of making it do one thing really, really well. Jake gestured toward where Crix's ship had been parked. That little bucket of bolts wasn't designed to fight wars or impress admirals or look good in parades. It was designed to get one small alien from point A to point B as efficiently as possible. Admiral Vex frowned. Explain. Weight is everything in space travel. Every gram of armor, every redundant system, every piece of military-grade equipment adds mass. More mass means more fuel. More fuel means bigger engines. Bigger engines mean more weight. It's a vicious cycle that your engineers have been trapped in for decades. Jake started pacing, getting into the rhythm of explanation. Crix's ship has exactly what it needs and nothing more. The hull is reinforced aluminum instead of military-grade titanium because he's not planning to get shot at. The life support system is designed for one person, not a full crew. The navigation computer is borrowed from a luxury yacht because rich people demand efficiency, while military computers are designed by committees who've never met a feature they didn't want to add. But surely there are safety considerations. Of course there are. But I designed them smart, not heavy. Instead of 3 backup oxygen systems, I installed one really good one with better redundancy built in. Instead of armor thick enough to stop a plasma cannon, I gave him enough speed and maneuverability to not be there when the plasma cannon fires. Admiral Vex was looking at Jake with the expression of someone who'd just realized they'd been trying to solve a puzzle by hammering the pieces together. You're saying our entire approach to spacecraft design is fundamentally flawed. I'm saying your approach to spacecraft design is fundamentally military, Jake corrected. Which is fine if you're planning to get into fights. But if you're trying to get from here to there as fast and cheap as possible, you might want to rethink your priorities. One of the junior officers stepped forward. Admiral, if his methodology is correct, we could potentially reduce operational costs by 40 to 60%, Jake finished. Maybe more depending on how attached you are to having cup holders made of platinum. Admiral Vex was quiet for a long moment, clearly running calculations in her head. When she spoke again, her voice had the tone of someone who'd just seen the promised land and realized it came with a very expensive cover charge. Mr. Murphy, I'm prepared to increase our offer. 75 ships, with a completion bonus for early delivery. We're talking about enough money to make you one of the wealthiest civilians in the outer colonies. Jake looked at the assembled military personnel, all of them watching him with the expectation of people who were used to getting what they wanted. He thought about Crix, somewhere out near Kepler 442, probably having dinner with his family in a ship that Jake had built with spare parts and stubbornness. He thought about what those same techniques could do in the hands of people whose job was to break things and hurt people. That's a very generous offer, Admiral, Jake said finally. But I'm going to have to pass. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that usually preceded either explosions or court-martial proceedings. Admiral Vex's expression shifted through several phases of disbelief before settling on something that looked like the early stages of a migraine. Mr. Murphy, I don't think you understand the situation you're in. Oh, I understand it perfectly, Jake replied, setting down his wrench with deliberate care. You want me to take everything I learned building a ship for a guy who just wanted to hug his kids again, and use it to make better ways to kill people. Thanks, but no thanks. There are legal ramifications to consider. Yeah, I figured there might be. Jake looked directly at Admiral Vex, and for the first time since she'd arrived, his expression was completely serious. But here's the thing about being a mechanic on the edge of nowhere, Admiral. You learn to tell the difference between people who need help and people who just want more efficient ways to cause trouble. Admiral Vex stared at him for a long moment, clearly reassessing everything she thought she knew about small-time garage owners who lived on the wrong side of civilization. You're making a mistake, Mr. Murphy. Probably, Jake agreed, but it's my mistake to make. Admiral Vex studied Jake's face for a long moment, her expression cycling through what looked like the 5 stages of military grief. Disbelief gave way to anger. Anger to bargaining to a kind of grim acceptance that suggested she'd dealt with stubborn civilians before but never quite like this. You realize, she said slowly, that I could have you arrested right now. Unlicensed spacecraft manufacturing, violation of aerospace regulations, failure to register with the Colonial Commerce Authority. That's just the beginning of the list. Jake nodded. I figured as much. You could spend the next 20 years in a penal colony, building widgets for the mining industry and dreaming about the fortune you turned down. Yep, and you're still saying no. Jake looked around his garage, taking in the organized chaos of tools, parts and half-finished projects that represented his entire life's work. It wasn't much to look at, but it was his. More importantly, it was built on the principle of fixing things that were broken, not breaking things that worked. Admiral, he said, let me tell you something about being a mechanic. Every day people bring me things that are broken. Sometimes it's simple stuff, like a faulty fuel pump, or a navigation computer that thinks up as sideways. But sometimes it's more complicated than that. He gestured toward the empty space where Kritzy's ship had been built. Sometimes, what's broken isn't the machine, it's the person's whole life. And when you fix that, when you give someone back their independence, or their hope, or their ability to see their family again, that's not just engineering, that's something worth doing. Admiral Vex's expression had shifted to something Jake couldn't quite read. And you think building ships for the military would compromise that? I think building ships for the military would turn me into a very different kind of mechanic. Jake replied. The kind who fixes things by breaking other things. The kind who builds solutions that create more problems than they solve. One of the junior officers stepped forward. Sir, with respect, the military serves an important function in protecting. Oh, I'm not saying you folks don't have your place, Jake interrupted. But your place isn't in my garage, and my place isn't in your war machine. I build ships for people who need to get somewhere. You build ships for people who need to stop other people from getting somewhere. Those are two very different jobs. Admiral Vex was quiet for another long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its military edge. You know, Mr. Murphy, in 30 years of military service, I've met a lot of civilian contractors. Most of them would have taken the money and asked where to sign. Most of them probably didn't have to look Kritz in the eye and explain why his ship was being used to blow up someone else's family. Fair point. Admiral Vex turned to her entourage. Pack it up. We're leaving. The junior officers looked confused, but military discipline kicked in and they began moving back toward the cruiser. Admiral Vex lingered for a moment, studying Jake with an expression that might have been respect or might have been the look of someone trying to figure out if they were dealing with a principled idealist or a complete lunatic. For what it's worth, Mr. Murphy, I think you're making the right choice. Even if it's not the smart choice. Those aren't always the same thing, Jake agreed. No, they're not. Admiral Vex extended her hand again, and this time her grip was firm but not crushing. If you ever change your mind about that contract, you know how to reach us. I'll keep that in mind. Admiral Vex paused at the bottom of the boarding ramp and looked back. One more thing, Mr. Murphy. That little friend of yours, Kritz. His ship's performance didn't just impress our engineers. It impressed our enemies too. There are going to be people who want to know how you did what you did. Jake felt a cold knot form in his stomach. What kind of people? The kind who don't take no for an answer as gracefully as I do. Admiral Vex's smile was sharp but not unkind. You might want to invest in better security, and maybe keep a low profile for a while. With that cheerful bit of advice, she disappeared into the cruiser. The massive ship lifted off with the same bone-rattling hum it had arrived with, leaving Jake standing in another cloud of dust and wondering if he'd just made the best decision of his life or signed his own death warrant. The answer came sooner than expected. Jake had barely finished sweeping the military-grade dust off his tools when he heard the familiar whine of an approaching ship. But this time, it wasn't a military cruiser. It was a small battered cargo hauler that looked like it had been through several wars and lost most of them. The ship landed with a thud that suggested its shock absorbers had given up hope sometime around the previous century. The airlock hissed open, and out stepped what could only be described as a walking advertisement for the benefits of universal health care. The newcomer was humanoid, but clearly not human, with blue-green skin, 6 arms, and what appeared to be a mechanical eye that whirred and clicked as it focused on Jake. Half of his left leg was clearly artificial, and his remaining organic parts were held together with what looked like prayer and medical tape. Excuse me, the alien said in accented but clear English. Are you the human mechanic, who builds impossible ships? Jake looked at the newcomer, then at his garage, then at the scorch marks on the ground where the military cruiser had landed. He thought about Admiral Vex's warning, about Kritz flying around the system in his miracle ship, and about the growing reputation that was apparently spreading through the galaxy's network of desperate people who needed help. He thought about turning the alien away, about hanging up a sign that said closed for business, and maybe moving to a nice quiet planet where the most exciting thing that happened was the occasional meteor shower. Instead, he found himself grinning. Depends what kind of impossible you're looking for, Jake said, gesturing toward his workbench. But I've got to warn you, I don't take military contracts, I don't build weapons, and I have a strict policy against violating the laws of physics more than twice per week. The alien's mechanical eye clicked and whirred. I do not need weapons, friend human, I need hope. Jake's grin widened. Well then, you've come to the right place. Hope is my specialty. As the alien began explaining his impossible request, Jake realized that Admiral Vex had been wrong about one thing. He hadn't made the right choice, or the smart choice. He'd made the only choice that would let him sleep at night, and that was going to have to be enough.